Hello there, and following on from my video about Miles Davis's 70s electric albums, I'd like to talk a little bit about the albums he made in the 80s and early 90s. I think these really get overlooked in his canon. They're critically seen as a bit inferior to his legendary albums like Kind of Blue and Miles Smiles and those sorts of albums. But I think there's a lot of worth in those albums. There are a lot of musicians that became superstars in fusion that originally played on those albums. And there's a sort of approach to playing jazz fusion, which again Miles pioneers in the 80s, which becomes the 80s jazz fusion sound. So they're really worth having a delve into. Now, as we said in the last video, in 1975, Miles Davis sort of retires from music and he disappears into a sort of drug-fueled world where he's not making any music, he's not practicing the trumpet. He does make some recordings in 1978 with Larry Coryell that haven't been released, where he's only playing keyboards. And then in 1981, it's announced that he's going to return. Now, by this point, Miles Davis is a legend. He's one of the great jazz artists. He's not necessarily seen as cutting edge at that point. And so he almost returns in a sort of heritage form with new band. And these albums from here on are some of Miles's most commercial albums. Now, I think the critics see these albums as being a sellout because he's using, pop cliches, drum machines, sampling, sequencing, a lot of funk grooves. There's a whole bunch of stuff there where I think the jazz critics see as a sellout. Whereas what they forget is that all the way through Miles's career, from playing, pop tunes like from Disney films like, Someday My Prince Will Come, through to taking on, electric instruments and psychedelia with the 70s electric albums, you see that he's always taken in, and it's just one element, he's taken in from popular culture, certain things, especially from popular black culture. And he's really leading the way when the way he takes them and twists them leads the way. So what do we get? What's the first album he returns with? Well, the first album is this one. Miles Davis, The Man with the Horn. Now, I would say, in terms of Miles Davis albums, this is a pretty weak album. He sounds weak. His sound's gone. He hasn't played trumpet for 5 or 6 years. He's had to practice to try and get that back. But what he has got here is an absolutely incredible band. He's got Al Foster, who was playing on the later 70s albums on drums. He's got Sammy Figueroa on percussion. He's got Bill Evans on saxophone. There we go. A real major player in the coming 80s, 90s, 2000s jazz scene. Bill Evans is a real voice, incredible player. Marcus Miller. Marcus Miller is going to become one of the defining sounds of 80s and 90s jazz fusion, and a really important musician to him for Miles. Got Barry Finnerty on guitar, and on Fat Time, one track, he's got Mike Stern on guitar. And I think Mike Stern really doesn't get the credit for readjusting fusion guitar in the 80s. He comes in with a sort of very bluesy, gutsy, but yet bebop fueled way of playing, and it also takes on a lot of sort of avant-garde free jazz influence, especially in his early playing. And he does a guitar solo on here, on the first track, Fat Time, that is one of my all-time great guitar solos. So although this is quite a weak album for me, that track, Fat Time, really embodies this new sound. And it's not a commercial sound. It's a brooding, controlled, quite menacing sound, which is sort of funk-based, jazz-based. Miles Davis keeps a control on it, allowing for when the musicians do start to solo for it to absolutely explode, which Mike Stern definitely does on that track. Incredible. And on this, I'm not going to be looking at all the live albums. On this, I'm going to look at mainly the studio albums. I'm not going to look at the soundtrack albums. I'll have a little chat about those when we get there. But I have included a few live albums, but not them all. But I have included this because this is absolutely monumental. This is recorded like 1982. It's pretty much the same band: Miles Davis, Marcus Miller, Bill Evans, Mike Stern, Al Foster, but with Mino Sinelu on percussion. And they are just burning. And for me, there is a new way of playing fusion on this album. Miles has done it again, you know. And it's a sound that's going to end up... All the other fusion bands in the 80s are going to take this sound. It's also going to appear on a million adverts. It's going to appear on a million, you know, TV intros and soundtracks and TV themes. You know, this sort of funky slap bass, funky guitar, the sort of muted trumpet sound. That's going to become a sound. It's really important sound for jazz. But on here, they are burning, especially Mike Stern. I'm a massive fan of Mike Stern's playing in the early days. I love him all the way through, but especially in on these early albums, he's just on fire and he's all over the place. They all are. Marcus Miller's also. He's redefining bass playing. He's taken slap bass. He's made it more sophisticated, more able to. It does more. Marcus can play slap bass in a way where he can do more. He can play like the head of a jazz standard on slap bass and make it work. So this is an essential album for, you know, if you want to get into 80s. Miles, brilliant. It's followed up by this one, Star People. And again, I think this is an absolutely fantastic album. He teams back up with Gil Evans. I think it's also produced by Tio Macero. I can't see. Should we just check that to make sure that my knowledge is right? Yeah, that's right. It's produced by Tio Macero. So this is a pretty heavy album. There's some beautiful slow blues on here. I think it is the track Star People is a incredible, and you see that Miles is back and he's stronger. But on the first track, Come and Get It, the interplay between Mike Stern and Marcus Miller is absolutely fantastic. And this is not, you know, this is not pop music. This is really heavy jazz improvisation, and that's what you get with the first three albums. After this, that band's gone. Marcus is gone. Mike Stern's gone, and we then get this album here. If I can just pick it up, Decoy. Decoy has got a different lineup. It introduces John Scofield. John Scofield actually appears on a track on Star People, but the lineup up on this is Miles Davis, Mino Sinelu, Al Foster. Got Robert Irving on synthesizers. Darryl Jones replacing Marcus Miller, who is a very Marcus Miller style bass, but incredible bass player. It's got Branford Marsalis on sax and John Scofield on guitar. Around about this time, early 80s, Wynton Marsalis had emerged, and Wynton, an incredible player, but for me, he did a lot of damage to jazz in trying to really put the emphasis on the history of jazz. You know, the importance of sort of standing there and pretending it's 1962 and you're wearing your suit and you're pretending that you're on a Blue Note label and you're playing sort of, you know, post-hard bop. And I think this was a terrible thing for jazz, and it created a split. And the critics, you know, it only reaffirmed their ideas that the only good jazz is proper straight-ahead jazz. And at the same time, the one guy that was an actual pioneer in that area, which is Miles, is coming out with albums like this. And I really like the fact that Branford, Wynton's brother, is on this album, and he's sort of going, yeah, well, you know, my brother's got one opinion, but I've got another. This album is fantastic. It carries on the sound of the first three albums. It develops it even more. It's probably got more of an ear towards the commercial sounds of the 80s, people like Michael Jackson and Prince, but don't think it's like a pop album. If I hold it, how do I hold it? There we go. There's a fantastic cover there. Don't think this is a pop album. There's some really heavy playing. Scofield is absolutely brilliant on here. Branford's absolutely brilliant, and they're really, you know, pushing a sort of time no changes sound that Miles had developed in the 60s, but over these like really funky 80s grooves. The production's great. It doesn't suffer from loads of gated reverb toms and, you know, all that sort of stuff that you get from 80s albums. This is a really, really fantastic album. There's a change at this point with Miles' 80s albums. I think the record company realised that he was quite iconic, and he starts appearing in programmes like Miami Vice and The Cosby Show and all this. And so he suddenly becomes, you know, a sort of celebrity. And you get this album, which I've always seen as a celebrity album. This is the real commercial. So he's done up on the front, looks like a bit like a Michael Jackson album cover. You know, very, very, it screams of 80s pop music. And then look at the guests on here. You know, you've got Sting on here, John McGoughlin returns on here. Who else? And we've got the standard lineup of, you know, Darryl Jones, Scofield. It's a sort of the second band. But this is interesting that he starts to do covers of pop songs. He does Cyndi Lauper, Time After Time, and he does Human Nature by Michael Jackson. I have no problem with this. Miles has done this all the way through his career. That is what he's always done, you know. And we're just seeing him doing it again. He really took those tunes and made them his own, you know. And when I saw Miles in 1990, they were real showstoppers when he did Human Nature. This is a great album. There's some real pop moments, there's some really funny moments, but there's also some incredible jazz playing on here. Incredible fusion. Now, we all know how dodgy a lot of the fusion was in the 80s, this sort of Fuzak, you know, middle of the road sound that was prominent at that time. But these albums don't suffer from that. This has got some proper heavy playing on it. I think the commercial side of Miles, the image, really comes to the fore with this album, the next album from 1986. And this also takes a shift because it's where you see certain people taking over the writing completely. It's been there all the way through. All the way through Miles' career, you can see there's certain points where he's writing, and his writing is very important. But you see there's other points where other composers are very, very important to him. So if you imagine In a Silent Way, you know, that's a Joe Zawinul composition. And so all the way through this, Miles is often playing other people's compositions. On here, this album's been really created and produced by Marcus Miller, and it really represents what 80s production was at that time. And Miles is shot through absolutely everything. There's a lot more use of drum machines. What is there has been really edited, you know, the takes have been cut together. This album should be terrible. It should be Miles really trying to sound like a Michael Jackson album, but it's a genre changer. You know, what Miles' sound on here changes jazz again, I think, and really creates the sound of 80s, early 90s jazz. And it's a fantastic album, and some of the compositions on here are absolutely fantastic. The playing is great, although it's really confined, and there's not much out there jazz improvisation on here. But I really do like this album. It still sounds up, the production stands up today. The production sounds absolutely fantastic. So that's a great album. There's none of these albums here that I've come across are that bad. By now he's got a new band, and that band is I can't see it on the back of here, so I have to do it off the top of my head. That band's got like Foley on lead bass, which is basically like a guitar. You know, he's got a number of saxophone players, including Kenny Garrett, who is the new star of 80s alto sax playing in the 80s. And this band is absolutely fantastic. We don't hear it on Tutu, but the band's integrated on this a little bit more. And this is a little bit more like Tutu, but just allowed a little bit more freedom in the solos. It's still pretty tight, still very much 80s production. I prefer this to Tutu, and I think some of the actual playing on here is great. There's a band emerging here, and that band, the late 80s band, was a fantastic band. In fact, I've pulled out a couple of live albums from that period that are well worth checking out. Miles Davis live around the world really shows you how great that late 80s band was. And also I've got this one here, which is a bit of a sort of unofficial album, if you can get hold of it, Miles and Montreux. And this really sounds like they weren't aware that the recording button was on, and they're really playing on here. Since Miles' death, they've also brought out an album called Rubber Band, which I haven't got, which really covers that band more. That late 80s, early 90s band was a fantastic band. I saw them live and they were really brilliant, and they were a really defining band. So for me there's sort of 2 to 3 bands in this period, and they're all fantastic bands. At this point, 1989, Miles wins an award, and I can't remember which award it is. I think it's the Sonning Award, it's like Sony Music Award. He wins an award. And there's a musician in Europe called Paul Nickelborg who's a big Miles fan, and he decides to create an album for Miles to play on, and it's this Almora. And he brings Miles over and he plays it as a double album. And the lineup is Miles obviously on trumpet, John McGoughlin on guitar, Vince Wilburn on drums, who was Miles' drum at the time. Then there's 3 keyboardists on here. other European musicians. You got Niels Henning Orts Pedersen, the jazz double bass virtuoso from Oscar Peters bands on here. Number of different drummers. It's almost orchestral, very reminiscent of the Gil Evans albums, but not, because it's heavy jazz fusion with a lot of rock and funk grooves on here. This for me is the best 80s Miles album. It gets overlooked. It's absolutely fantastic. And it seems to refer to all the different parts and all the different high points of Miles' career. And at this point, Miles starts to spread his wings in all sorts of different places. He makes a couple of soundtrack albums. There's the soundtrack to the film Siesta, and the soundtrack to the film Dingo, and they're very interesting, and they do stand up as Miles albums. I haven't included them here because I don't think they would be go-to albums. But he starts the early 90s doing two things. He makes a couple of albums that really go back to his past. He makes an album with Quincy Jones, which is a live album, which really looks back to the Gil Evans band. But the one that's looking forward, just before he dies, is this album here, Doo-Bop. I think this is probably the weakest of all the albums I've looked at today. Was Miles Davis opening new territory up? He was trying to deal with rappers and hip hop. It's a bit clunky in the way he does that. There are some interesting tracks that were made after he died where they integrate his trumpet onto hip hop tracks and they double it up, and they're quite interesting. It's interesting to hear where Miles is going with that. But of course he dies, so we don't hear anymore. So that's my look at the albums of Miles Davis in the 80s. Like I say, they are absolutely fantastic. There's loads of riches to be found on there. Loads of interesting things, that you will find. Very influential on the way jazz went in the 80s, really created that sound. And like I said, musicians like John Scofield, Mike Stern, Bill Evans, Kenny Garrett, a whole bunch of players that really start their careers off. So yeah, well worth checking out. I hope you enjoyed this video. Hope you get a little idea of what those albums are like if you're looking at dipping your toe into Miles's 80s albums. And if you like the video, drop some comments in, let's have a chat, click like and subscribe, and I will see you soon. Thank you very much. Bye.